Fantasy-animation.org is a website with a difference. It is not for profit, and it's run entirely by academics and professional animators, and this means that whether you are reading our latest blog or accessing our latest podcast, thanks for downloading by the way, you can be sure that you are getting the most up-to-date and informed commentary on the colliding worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Whether you are a budding animator yourself, a student of fantasy or animation, or just someone who wants to learn more about the history and theory behind these overlapping media, mediums and genres, why not find out more at fantasy-animation.org or subscribe to our various social media threads on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Reddit, at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research. While you're at it, subscribe to the podcast, give us a star rating, and better yet, a quick written review as well. It all helps to make the visibility of our project even stronger and attract more like-minded people like yourself to our growing network of fans. For now, do enjoy the show.
Welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. With me, Chris, definitely do feed me after midnight holiday.
And Alex, Chris just stole my own joke, Sergeant.
So, thank you. Yes, good. In true fantasy animation fashion, this is one of our quasi-festive episodes recorded months earlier in the year, though not as early as we have done it in the past, where this episode we're taking on the children's horror Gremlins, directed by Joe Dante. Now, initially, I thought I was going to struggle in terms of animation, but I think there's a lot to say around definitions of animation, particularly in relation to puppetry, and actually particularly in relation to Alex's own work on Jim Henson, and whether the liveness of puppetry includes or excludes it from frame-by-frame understandings of the medium. And I also really want to talk about Snow White, which will become clear as the episode proceeds. Alex, I've already set you up a little bit, but what else is there to say about such animatronic and puppeted creatures when it comes to fantasy?
Oh, God, I don't know. Monsters, beasts, the imaginative object of play. There's loads of stuff to potentially talk about in terms of Gremlins as a fantasy as well as Gremlins as creatures of fantasy. But I've got to be honest, I feel like me and you are having a stab in the dark here. Both of us hadn't seen the movie 24 hours ago. This is a public name and shaming of our lack of knowledge of all things Gremlins. I think we need someone to help us out, Chris.
We do. So if me and you are newbies to the film, I think our guest is definitely not. We're joined by Dr. Catherine Lester, who is a lecturer in film and television in the Department of Film and Creative Writing at the University of Birmingham. Now, her work largely focuses on the intersections between children's culture and the horror genre, which obviously I think leads to occasional forays, if that's fair, into animation. Her first book, Horror Films for Children, Fear and Pleasure in American Cinema, is literally hot off the press, coming out only a matter of weeks ago, and she's also published two on popular animation as well as other areas related to children's horror. She's also currently putting together an edited collection on the animated film Watership Down, while previously she's also written for us, for Fantasy Animation, reviewing Frozen 2, but also interrogating the subversive horror of fantasy animation, looking at, amongst other things, Coraline. So, Catherine, thank you very much for coming on the episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, you are very much the expert here, I think, when it comes to a film like Gremlins. So, just as to kind of kick things off, where does the film, so this is 1984, this is Joe Dante, where does this film fit into your research, particularly in relation to that? What I know you've talked about a lot is that sort of fuzzy category of children's horror that is kind of so central to your research.
Well, Gremlins was kind of where everything started for me. When I very first got interested in children's horror, I knew straight away I have to get Gremlins into this somehow. So when the book is based on my PhD thesis, so when I started my PhD, Gremlins was the first case study that I started writing up for no other reason really than I just really, really liked Gremlins, and I would do whatever it took to, I guess, come up with a definition of children's horror that would allow me to talk about Gremlins, because I think maybe we'll get into this. It doesn't necessarily seem in some ways to be a children's film. For example, it's rated a 15 in the UK. But
is it?
It is, yeah.
Wow.
But but certainly within its national context in North America, it is rated a PG, and it was very contentiously rated a PG. So in many ways, it, for me, is the sort of starting point, both of my interest in children's horror, but also of children's horror as a category in American cinema. So it's not the first ever children's horror film. That would be silly. It came out in 1984. But partly because of the fact that it was rated PG, and so it had there was a kind of backlash to it because people felt that it was too violent for the PG rating. As a result, a new category was added to the American rating system of PG-13. So Gremlins is partly responsible for that major watershed moment in American cinema. The other film that was responsible for this was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which was also notoriously a very violent film, rated PG. And then, so then that kind of had almost like a snowball effect in that PG-13 then opened up a bit more space for films in that fuzzy category, which were maybe a bit too scary to be PG rated, but not quite scary enough to be R rated, which is like the equivalent of our 15. So historically, it's really interesting. I also think that the gremlin creatures themselves are these wonderful, subversive, interesting representations of children. And I don't know if I should get into this now or maybe wait later or something, but my sort of big take on Gremlins is that the Gremlins themselves are these subversive figures of identification, that they are these analogues for children. And that in itself is a really interesting turning point for me in children's horror cinema, because before then, and still indeed at the moment, children in adult horror films tend to get represented either as these very straightforward victims who need to be saved, or they're these demonic villains that we see in something like The Omen and stuff like that. So in children's horror films, Gremlins included, children or child substitutes get to be more complex, more interesting. And Gremlins, again, it's this turning point where you see these child substitute characters who are acting up and basically, in my reading, disrupting this dominant culture where children don't really get to be childish. And the Gremlins come in and they basically... Can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah.
They fuck everything up. And it's great.
So you said the word subversive in your answer there, and I think that's going to be one of the kind of buzzwords of the podcast. We're recording this with the intention of it being a Christmas episode, so people could perhaps play a Christmas drinking along game anytime we say the word subversive or anarchic or madcap or all these words that we want to throw out the kind of energy. Carnivalesque, yeah. Oh, yeah. Double shot if we mention back teen. Oh, it's going to get great. But perhaps before we start, I can see Chris with his head in his hands, listeners. Is one of the reasons that these films can start to acquire a subversive energy just kind of by their genre status or their tone or their sensibility is that I'm reminded of an article I've not read in years, but an article by the Five Live critic Mark Kermode about kind of horror cinema. I think it's called Horror Cinema on the Edge of Taste, and he sort of argues that horror will always have a kind of butting relationship with censorship laws, because by the very nature of horror, it's one of its impulses is to engage with limits and the difference between the obscene and the on stage and that kind of stuff. And you can have that battleground at the 18 level with, like, you know, the kind of, I don't know, a boring but an obvious example would be something like Human Centipede, right, which is really kind of trying to confront the viewer with the limits of taste. But you could also do it at the level of what's acceptable for both a rating category like PG-13 or 12A in this country, and what's acceptable for children, right? And it's almost like by lowering the stakes of or lowering the age bracket, you can have an equally subversive battle, but perhaps not going to the lengths of the sort of upper echelons of the age limit, or the upper echelons of the censorship level. So you can almost have the battle on two fronts. You can have the battle of what's the limits of all horror filmmaking, but then what's the limits of what we'll show our children, and what that might mean.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why I think that children's horror as a category is just inherently subversive, even when it's concerning films that are not especially scary. Like I mentioned, the Hotel Transylvania films, for example. Just the idea of a category of film that's children's horror, because of the idea that children and horror don't go together, and when they do, bad things happen, that makes the genre itself just inherently, subversive. Yeah. I feel like we've just used that word so many times already now, so people must be wasted.
Absolutely.
Listening to this.
Happy holidays, everybody. But it also links to this kind of, to talk about sort of my own genre of fantasy. It relates to this sort of romantic notion of the child as this kind of vessel for the imagination, right? And in fantasy literature, children often appear because they're seen as having some sort of access to the imaginative world in a way that we lose at adulthood. But with that, and that's seen as a positive thing because it means they can, dance with unicorns and go on flights with fairies and all that kind of stuff. But the flip side of that is that there's this perception that because they're so imaginatively sensitive, that horror can affect them in ways that they're not protected against, which obviously the evidence is not necessarily there for. But I guess it's kind of it's subversive in its relationship to fantasy, and that fantasy is its kind of cuddly, acceptable, what we want, what we think and want kids to be doing with their imagination. But often what kids are actually doing with their imagination is imagining monsters in their cupboard and gremlins round the corner. So it's subversive in that level, in that it presents, and it sounds like a lot of what your work is dealing with, it is that representation, but it represents childhood in a way we're not that comfortable thinking about, because we like the idea of childhood being innocent and pure, but they are none of these things.
We like the idea that a child is like Gizmo, the Mogwai,
yes.
Cute and fluffy and easy to control because he's very compliant, doesn't like breaking rules, whereas the Gremlins are representative in my reading of what happens, what adult society fears will happen when a child accesses horror, which is that they will turn into these monstrous beasts, and they will break all the rules. They may even kill people, or they might just do really fun things that children like to do, like break into a bar and go wild, break into the cinema and eat all the candy, attack Santa Claus. I don't know.
But that's part of the pleasure, isn't it? To sort of lean into the messiness of this. That's this thing. Going back to the application of these kinds of categories, is that yes, we can resist the way that they are used, or the way that they're applied to certain films, or the way that films are sold, and where we find books in the library about those films. But it is really interesting to sort of lean into that chaotic messiness, and it is interesting that, as you say, certain films aren't badged in the same way. And Alex, you're looking quizzical at me, as if we need to start actually talking about Gremlins.
You
properly.
picked up on the look perfectly there, Chris. Yeah, let's talk about Gremlins. So, I don't know if I'm going to have much in the way of robust discourse to contribute to this, other than that the Gremlins look kind of cool. But if I do have anything to offer to this, and I would like us all to complicate it, is that I think the two things that struck me about Gremlins when watching it was that I wasn't expecting to be struck by, was one, how cine literate it was, and how much it looked almost nostalgically back to genres of 1940s, 1950s Hollywood, and two, how contemporary it was at the same time, in how 1980s the film is grounded in. So to start us off, I'd like to talk about the opening. The opening kind of coda, where we're introduced to the Gremlin, Mogwai, the Mogwai. So as clear something up for me immediately, Kat. Are these things called Gremlins, or are they called Mogwai? That's question number one.
Both. I think both. I mean, the little fuzzy, cute ones, which you can see behind me.
Yes, there's
that's
a model.
Mogwai.
Right, there's a model
Yeah.
of a Mogwai in the bottom left of Kat's Zoom photo, everybody.
Yeah. Officially, they're Mogwai, but within the film, everyone refers to the things that the Mogwai turn into, which are more kind of lizard-like, as gremlins. So I think for differentiation purposes, it's Mogwai when they're cute and fluffy and gremlins when they're not.
Great. Okay, so we're introduced to a Mogwai, which our protagonist's father is the first character we meet, Randall, who's an inventor, and we kind of get a kind of weird film noir-esque voiceover intro that kind of starts this tale off as if it's Double Indemnity. We're introduced to these creatures, and we find our character in a antique store in Chinatown, and there's this whole weird yellow peril anti-Chinese, anti-East Asian sentiment going on that's reflected throughout the whole thing, which seems to be that one of the things that we should be suspicious of straight away about these Mogwai is that they come from distant shores and that they are not to be trusted as a result. So, first off, very weird that this is a film noir movie, I've got written in my notes. Second off, yellow fever movie, anti-Asian sentiment, era of Fu Manchu, ? So, there we go. Very weird 1940s riffing, but also very much rooted in 1980s fear and anxiety. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah. I don't think I'd ever thought of it as film noir before, but I think because of the voiceover, you're correct. Although I don't know if I have anything more to say about that. And yeah, I think, although in my book I talk about the film as children's horror and about the Gremlins as these substitute children, we absolutely have to acknowledge it's like extremely Orientalist and racist in the way it's representing Asian culture here. And I think other people smarter than me have written in more detail about that aspect.
The only thing to add, I was thinking about Who Framed Roger Rabbit and the use of noir in that sense. But actually, I was sort of, it did strike me as very noir. I didn't know what to expect, as you said. I hadn't watched it before, and the opening with the voiceover coupled with the citations of sort of popular Hollywood cinema across different genres. Of course, the film looks like Back to the Future because it is Back to the Future. It is the set of Back to the Future, but it also is citing Snow White and it's citing It's Wonderful Life, and so. But the noir citation was interesting simply because of Hollywood at the time and the turn towards neo noir and Chinatown and that sort of mid 1970s. Noir gets to a point where it turns back on itself, and again, actually, there's a fuzziness between when does noir end and when does neo noir begin, and the sort of the postmodern reflexivity of noir getting to a point and then starting to look back, notwithstanding debates around whether it is a genre, a mode, a zeitgeist, and all that sort of stuff. So I think actually the citation of noir, visually at least, or stylistically in relation to the voiceover, perhaps does something in relation to an imaginary of fear, or masculine fear, I guess, masculine anxiety. Masculinity is always in crisis, as we know, and this crisis is kind of channeled through the father, who is desperately trying to make himself success. You know, he hands out all these cards the whole way through, almost to the point of parody. But you're right. It was sort of film noir meets an Orientalist understanding of otherness, which didn't necessarily sit, or I didn't know what to expect that the rest of the film was going to be based on that opening.
I think that you said it's almost to the point of parody, but I think it absolutely is parodic in its representation of the father. And I think that this introduction is quite really interesting and quite crucial to that, because his voiceover only appears right at the beginning here and then again right at the end, but he's not in the film for quite a lot of it. So, and he's not presented as someone who's like got his shit together. Mm-hmm. He's presented as a really foolish man. He's a bad inventor, not an especially good father and husband as a result of not being a good inventor, because that's his livelihood and he doesn't make any money off of it. It's his fault, basically, that all of the events of the film get kicked off, because he takes this this Mogwai without the permission of the shop owner, blah, blah, blah. So for me, he's represented deliberately as this ridiculous figure, and it's playing upon this idea of the kind of patriarch, but and the voiceover that bookends the film feeds into that. But I think it's supposed to be like, this guy's an idiot. Look at this guy. He's caused all these problems, and then he comes back sort of serendipitously at the end once everything's resolved, as if it's like his doing. But no, he's just there by accident.
Yeah. To me, there are two other things at fault, though, in that opening sequence. There's the ineffectiveness of the father, but there's also the fact that the child, the sort of kid that sells him the Mogwai, is desperate to sell it. So we have the force of sort of commercialism, commerce, fueling this thing happening. And the final thing that's the problem is that this Mogwai is taken from a place that they understand him, that he has a sort of cultural history with. They know how to treat the Mogwai, they know how to look after the Mogwai, and he's sold as a commodity outside of that to this American small town family. And there's this recurring, this anti-Asian kind of sentiment. Yes, it plays out on a kind of body politic, body fear level right at the beginning, where we get these kind of, quote-unquote foreign spaces. But actually, the more recurring line in the movie seems to be, it's a foreign piece of crap, is what people say quite a lot, right? Things are foreign, and what's scary about them is they represent this kind of globalized, capitalism of the 1980s, yeah? Toys that are being sold in every country around the world are bad because they no longer represent the communities of which they are made for. So I think, in one way, what these visual references back to the 1940s and 50s are, is they're a reference back to Bedford Falls, It's a Wonderful Life, small town 1940s America, where everything is quaint and local and belonging to an individual community. And what the film's setting up kind of tonally in those opening sections is a threatening to that, caused by these gremlins. But we could see the gremlins as much as representations of kind of of capitalism, right, or of free market economy, as much as they are of children.
Absolutely. And I think the second film, which we won't talk about, but the second film really leans into that a lot more, and leans into the satirical elements a lot more. But
okay,
maybe we could save that for another podcast.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. So we haven't met our heroes yet. Our heroes are who are they?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the heroes are the Gremlins. But well,
who are the heroes supposed to be for the first 10 minutes?
As far as what the film tells us at the beginning, so we have the father, Randall Peltzer, who tells us in his voiceover he's buying a Christmas present for his kid, which I also think is really interesting, because then we expect Billy to actually be a child, and
sure,
we see him, and he's like a grown adult,
50.
Yeah, but I think that's also really interesting, because he's presented as this quite ambiguous figure, at least in terms of age. He is treated as a child by his father, at least, and he behaves childish in certain ways. We see him going to work at a bank, which is quite a grown-up job. I think we will probably agree. But he hides his dog under his desk, which gets him in trouble. He has a little clip-on tie, which reads as quite childish. He puts his nameplate is upside down, so he's not a very put together. He's not adulting very well for someone who is supposed to be an adult, as far as we can tell. So Billy is presented to us as our protagonist, Randall's son, and later that day, Billy goes home and he gets given Gizmo, the Mogwai, as his early Christmas present.
It's interesting. So here's the thing I noticed. Why do none of the people in this movie, until these creatures turn into gremlins, whilst they're Mogwai, find them anything but slightly amusing toys? There seems to be what I picked up on, quite a normalising rhetoric going on, which is that these kind of, these beasts from out of space, these creatures from the beyond, these, rather cute looking but essentially extraterrestrial objects appearing in small town America, no one seems to bat an eyelid, because they're cute. They look nice, and so people kind of pat them on the head and go, oh, that's a cute toy, and move on with their lives. No one seems to be particularly shocked by the appearance of the gremlin until it turns into said gremlin. Yeah.
And of course, what we haven't mentioned so far is that Mogwai comes with 3 very important rules.
Yes.
As well, which, again, you'd think that those would raise flags. So you're not supposed to expose him to bright light, and especially not sunlight, as it will kill them. Don't expose them to water, and as we find out, that's because water makes them multiply. And don't feed them after midnight, because that is what turns them into the titular gremlins.
So, I suppose this is where the animation comes in for me, because this whole sort of treating them as toys, the importance of the materiality of animatronics. As you say, at the very, very beginning, the father goes to get a toy and ends up with essentially a toy. And part of that, I think we're supposed to read them as merchandise. I think this is a film that's got one eye on the post-cinema existence of itself. It's sort of, this is what children will buy. We are this close to a Furby. So there's something going on.
Mogwai Furbies, and in fact the marketing of the film also very much situated it as being a children's film. There were loads of Gizmo toys and plushies. It was advertised like it had a cereal tie-in and that kind of stuff. So sorry to interrupt.
No. No, I think the merchandise thing is important, because he's essentially trying to buy something that may or may not be the latest fad, or he's at least discovered something that he thinks his child will like, irregardless of the fact is, children in the 80s, if they're not 5 or 6, look about 35, 40. But anyway, there is something interesting then about what happens when they multiply. And as you said, Alex, that sort of the intensification or the acceleration of a particular object as it seems to move through quite a hysterical population. And it was difficult to not connect that back up to a desire to get the latest toy. And actually, that's where I think the animatronic or the materiality of stop motion. Sorry, the materiality of stop motion, but in this case, the 3-dimensionality of actual animatronics that characters can hold and they can kind of cradle and put in backpacks, and is really important. I think it lends itself to that narrative of these objects are somehow collectible and they will run rife because of their popularity within this relatively small community. And I know that you've written on puppetry and that even if we don't consider puppetry a form of animation, because it isn't created frame by frame, it is at the very least part of a set of conversations that surround what animation is. And in this case, I definitely think the materiality or the 3-dimensionality of the objects as they are being held and then they run riot through the world of the film is very much tied to their status, or hints at their status, as these essentially are sentient toys. This is something that obviously Toy Story and animation has always been fascinated with. Toys come alive, but here we seem to have missed off the bit where they come alive. They are just alive. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you end up getting is before they hatch and we get the more horrific elements of the story. We get an equally horrific thing, which is just like this. We're watching a craze take place here. We're watching the latest craze play out in a small town, in that all these characters see the Mogwai, see Gizmo and his friends, and want one and desire one. And as I say, like they don't seem to have any appreciation for the fact these are living things. They don't have any appreciation for the strangeness of the object and the fact that perhaps these objects don't belong in a space like this. They just look cute. They serve a commercial function, and therefore they are worth obtaining. And there's not much questioning beyond that. And in a way, we talk about rhetorics of fantasy. There's almost an ironic rhetoric going on, because what you'd expect would be a kind of intrusive, oh my god, what's this creature kind of rhetoric, and that doesn't happen until they turn into gremlins. That the kind of what we get is a much more normalized world where this all seems to be perfectly fine and no one seems to be batting an eyelid. It's only when shock horror, these things actually have a life of their own, desires of their own.
And they're not cute anymore.
Yeah, so cuteness is a really important factor to this. Talk to us about cuteness in this, because they start off designed cute and they become quote-unquote not cute. So how important is that in terms of aesthetics of children's horror?
Very. I think probably.
Great. Next question. No.
But yeah, I think the part of the reason why I'm like the Gremlins are the unfairly maligned victims of this story is because they just hatch. They, everyone reacts to the Gremlins with hostility purely on the basis of kind of what they look like, and the fact that they're basically just minding their own business and defending themselves against all of these, what I read as unjust attacks, because they're not cute anymore and because they're not compliant with this like adult gaze anymore.
Yeah, and thought about it like that, and actually, it's their refusal to kind of be defined by these adults, by their use value to these adults that make them so problematic to the society. Yeah, they don't work as toys anymore because they don't look cute anymore. So there's an immediate hostility towards them, and then the threat they pose. It's not a kind of, I mean, they keep getting compared to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? That's another 1950s reference that appears. And there's this sense that they're going to take over society and consume them all, or kill them all, or eat them all, or some sense of kind of that society is under threat. But actually, they're quite happy to participate in their own way. They want to go to, as you say, they want to go to the cinema, they want to go to the bar, they want to just, they want to kind of get on with stuff. But it's the fact they won't let them that causes the narrative tension. It's not them trying to kind of, they're not trying to take over. They're just trying to like have a date night, it would seem.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that they do kill some people in the film.
Yeah.
But it's really important.
It's always
really
important to point that
who
out.
they kill. Because the probably the most shocking human death and maybe the only human death actually that happens in the film is Mrs. Deagle, who we see at the beginning as this grouchy old woman. She's like a landlord or something who's refused extensions on rent to destitute families, and she says she's going to kill Billy's dog. And there's a Margaret Hamilton, Wicked Witch of the West.
I'm glad you did it because I was about to do it. Yeah, absolutely. We've got one part Mr. Potter and one part Mrs. Gulch, Wicked Witch of the West going on. Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
So she's very clearly established as probably the only true villain in the film. And what do the Gremlins do? They do everyone else a really big favour by launching her out of her window on a stair lift.
Is it significant then that the Gremlins, as a result, in terms of the acts, their agency, it's significant that Billy isn't a child? Because I think if he was a young child, the Gremlins would. I was expecting a kind of E.T.-esque. We have a young child and we have a creature who helps. They learn from each other, or the child has something missing in his life, and ultimately it's filled by this essentially extraterrestrial. But with Billy being slightly older, there is no requirement for the Gremlins or even the Mogwai to fulfill a certain kind of function. They don't have to. I mean, there is a kind of whiff of that, but actually it seems like their agency is propelled, or they're defined not in relation to what they can provide for other people, but they just end up, as you say, acting of their own accord. And if they want to go to the cinema, they'll just go to the cinema. I was a bit shocked by the chainsaw, but that's by the by. But I just thought that was really interesting. I was expecting a narrative whereby these Gremlins are used as I don't know, a kind of surrogate father or a surrogate parent to one of the children. I don't necessarily think that's true here, and I think it comes from the fact Billy isn't a young child.
I think if anything, it's the opposite. That Billy is framed as the surrogate father to Gizmo. And especially when he first holds Gizmo, he's kind of cradling him like a baby. And so I see Billy as almost kind of like a tragic figure in that he, as I said before, he's not very good at adulting. But his dad comes home and basically gives him a newborn child to look after. And he's not ready for that. He doesn't have the responsibility or the means to take care of this thing. And so it's that kind of being given too much responsibility too soon that by a father who's an irresponsible figure already, that causes that kind of knock-on effect and results in the chaos that we see.
He's not good at adulting in a kind of 1980s go get 'em. You should be working in a city bank by now. But he seems relatively capable. I think that's
more capable than his own dad, at least.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the advantages of making him older, as opposed to the sort of the younger version of. There's another version of this where the child is younger, is that he is more capable of sort of being an effective protagonist against the physical threat of these gremlins. And I can't remember the name, but there's this rivalry he has with this other Gerald, thank you.
Gerald
who is like he is the epitome of kind of, he is Marty McFly at the end of Back to the Future, as opposed to Marty McFly at the beginning. No, sorry, George McFly at the end of Back to the Future, as opposed to George McGuy at the beginning of Back to the Future. He's a epitome of 1980s go get 'em success, and he's an absolute. Well, we've already sworn on the podcast, so we'll keep going. He's an absolute knobhead. Like he's not who we're supposed to admire. He's not the kind of adult we're supposed to like, and it all adds to this kind of subversive, there we go, in case anyone's sobered up, energy to the thing, in that one of the things this thing is taking down is just 80s culture and 80s consumerism. I loved all that. Chris, it's probably time to talk about Gremlins and their animated nature. So I think there are two things we could mention here. I think we should talk about the cinema scene. So there is a key scene in this film where the Gremlins go to the cinema and watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But I think more broadly we could talk about the way the physicality of these creatures, once they become aware, embodies actually a kind of slapstick, Warner Brothers, Looney Tune-esque kind of anarchic quality that the film also enjoys. And I'm thinking particularly of the bar sequence that's one of the sort of standout moments in the film. So I don't know. Over to you, Chris. Gremlins and their animated nature. You've said they're like objects, but they're also like cartoon characters, aren't they?
They are, and actually the first point, or your second point, has answered the first point, insofar as I was trying to get my head around why or what the Snow White sequence is doing in the film, because of all the things that they could go to the cinema to see. That seems like a very interesting. In what world have they gone to the Prince Charles or something? In what world are they showing in 1984 a 1937 film just casually? Don't understand it. And I think the answer lies in the division between that and Warner Brothers. And there are plenty of films where animation is put on television to show something. We've just, if those of you who've seen the new Bond film, there is Wallace and Gromit playing on a television that gives us an indication of the time or the moment that the sequence is set. But also, isn't it great that kids watch? That's what kids watch. They watch certain kinds of animation, and there's a long history of certainly Disney animation being used in this particular way. There's a film from the 40s, Sullivan's Travels, which is about a group of prisoners who end up going to the cinema and end up watching a really plasmatic, silly symphony short, and it's supposed to kind of counterpoint their rigid, mechanized existence as they all are chained together by seeing this fluid, malleable world on screen. So I don't, in that sense, yes, they are going to the cinema to watch Snow White because animation is, there, I've said it, entertaining. Right. But I think actually the division here, or the reason why it's Snow White, is to counterpoint a different kind of animated behaviour. So Disney were known for a particular kind of sentimental modernism, a hyper-realist aesthetic, versus the animated anarchy of the Looney Tunes and Warner Brothers and Merry Melodies and Tom and Jerry and Roadrunner and all that kind of stuff. And you're absolutely right that the Gremlins embody that side of the spectrum. They are characters whose bodies are a sign. And I think at one point one of the scientists talks about metamorphosis, a change of form and appearance. And very kind of famously, unless it was rooted in magic, Disney animation didn't really kind of go in for that after a particular period, whereas there is something around cartoon violence and the fragmented ability of bodies to sort of change and shatter, and then in the next scene be absolutely perfect again. I think, and in fact, isn't Billy an aspiring comic book writer or comic book artist? And I was looking online, and isn't Chuck Jones his teacher in the film or something like that? He's credited as the comic book artist's teacher is Chuck Jones, and obviously Chuck Jones was known for Looney Tunes and Warner Brothers, so it's definitely trying to stick its flag in the sand. This is a different kind of animated anarchy that is far removed from that hyper-realist sentimentality and musicality, because the sequence that the Gremlins watch in the cinema is the Hi-Ho sequence. It's a musical number. And this film isn't doing that. So that's the only... your second point kind of answered the first, or clarified the first to me, because I was unsure as to what that citation of Snow White was doing. But it does seem to try and create a division between different kinds of animated action and violence and kind of character.
Well, for me, I think that the fact that they're watching Snow White is key to seeing the Gremlins as these child substitutes. Especially because it's not any point of Snow White that they're watching. They're not watching one of the scary bits. Because as we've established, Snow White is very scary. They're watching one of the most kind of joyful and happy bits of Snow White, which is the dwarfs singing hi ho, hi ho. And at that moment, all of the Gremlins stop what they're doing, because they've been like tearing apart the cinema and causing chaos. They all stop and they're just entranced by the film. They start singing along, and it's what I find especially kind of tragic about what happens to them, is that it's at that moment when they are their most childish, when Billy and his friend Kate choose to blow up the cinema, at that point when they're just being the most innocent that they could possibly be.
Well, no, I'm just going back to this thing of the violence of media and the child audience, I suppose. Criticisms of video games or violent video games or rap music, as children listen to rap music and they will automatically be violent. But if they listen to if they listen to Dido and become apathetic, we don't blame Dido for their apathy, but we can definitely blame rappers for violence. But that's a separate thing. But I wonder whether the point that the film is making by choosing a particular sequence from Snow White that isn't, as Kat said, particularly scary and is actually quite jovial, and it's about the end of the workday
as well, isn't it? So it's about that shaping them into the good little capitalists that they'll grow up to be, or something.
Yeah. But I suppose it's also saying that their behaviour, the behaviour of the Gremlins, isn't intrinsically related to what they're watching on screen. You can't say that, the reason that they're acting up like this in the cinema is because of the thing that they are watching. And it's almost trying to position... I'm not trying to say that it's apologising. The animation isn't going to cause this, or that... Is it saying something about itself, that it doesn't matter how violent the film is, it's not going to impact, or it's not going to impact or influence children in the way that you think, because children don't necessarily think like adults, and those judgments that we make around media are often aimed at adult subjects rather than thinking through and nuancing a children's response to that, because it seems like their relationship to what's the Snow White on the screen isn't really... They're kind of not really watching it, and they kind of are in some instances, but then they start to sort of destroy the cinema. And I don't know, I'm just wondering whether it's trying to make a comment on the palatability of media, this role of the childlike gremlin as vessel for imagination, or I don't know. Is it trying to at least say something around the susceptibility of children that isn't really susceptibility at all?
Well, there is at least one moment in the film where a child, by which I mean Gizmo, copies something that he's seen in a film, which is when earlier in the film we see him watching a racing film starring Clark Gable, which I think is called To Please a Lady. And later in the film, in the department store, he takes a little toy car and he uses that and is instrumental in using that to defeat Stripe, the last remaining gremlin. So if anything, the film is saying that media can be a positive influence on kids. And actually, for the first time on this rewatch, I noticed that when he's watching that film on TV, there's also a Mad Max Road Warrior poster just on the other side of the TV, and which I had never noticed before. But he's not... I guess, is he doing Road Warrior? Is he influenced by Road Warrior, or is he influenced by the more kind of soft Clark Gable film? But either way, I think maybe it doesn't matter. He's watched something and he's taken that and he's done something that the broader culture would consider good with it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's also worth comparing the Snow White sequence with the bar sequence that comes after it, and perhaps it's important it's that way round, in that
as before. The bar
Is
sequence
it?
is first.
Okay, then the
Yeah.
point I was about to make is redundant, but I'll keep trying to make it anyway, because that's what I do on this podcast. No, but okay, well, if it's the other way round, then the point gets reversed. But it's interesting that in the bar sequence, then it feels like this is like Gremlin Home, right? This is like you're introduced to it. Phoebe Cates' character is kind of desperately trying to keep these things at bay, serve them drinks and stuff. They're having the time of their life. They're trashing things. It looks like they're having enjoy, but it also just kind of looks like a rowdy bar. Like it looks like and we could, if we wanted to get puritanical about it, and I guess if we made the reference to It's a Wonderful Life, this anyway looks like the alternative Bedford Falls of that movie, where everything's kind of strip joints and bars and sleazy, and we could argue that this is an indictment on bar culture. It's saying, look at these seedy places. It's the kind of places gremlins hang out and all this kind of stuff. But then a gremlin can also hang out in a cinema, and a gremlin can still enjoy Snow White. So it's almost like it's saying, there's a duality, right? It's not about that Snow White keeps people like Mogwai and bars turn people into gremlins. They are still gremlins, regardless of whether they're laughing at dwarfs or drinking beers in a bar. They remain what they are, no matter what.
But also that it's difficult and fuzzy to create a kind of cause and effect chain between something that happens on screen and then the resultant action. If, as you say, there is that duality in play where they're getting influences from all kinds of things. As I said, I don't necessarily think that the film is openly apologetic in that sense, but it is also saying, look, there is a space for children's horror that isn't going to result in a barroom brawl, because if they're going to brawl, they'll brawl anyway, or they'll brawl because they've seen it somewhere else. So I'm just trying to given that spectatorship is a really important dimension of children's horror and horror generally, horror is a body genre, because it's one of the genres that make us feel horrific. It's like pornography. There are genres. I can't remember who talks about body genres. Linda Williams, yeah. So there are differences between body genres and genres that make us feel something else. Or a Western might make us feel or react in a slightly different way and less bodily than something like horror. But seemingly, because spectatorship is so important, and modes of spectatorship are so important, and the child viewer is so important to horror, it seems like to set a sequence in a cinema is making a commentary in some way about the pleasures and the perils of spectatorship and media consumption and things like that.
I guess we're coming short to the end of our episode, and given that we've talked a lot about the films offering these spaces to think about media's impact upon children, media's impact upon society, the relationship between consumerism and cinema. I wondered, Kat, did you have anything you could tell us about the reception of the movie? Because obviously the film, I'd like to know what the immediate reception was. I'm aware that there was perhaps a little bit of tension or controversy. Is that over-egged, or is that true of the time? And then what the sort of, legacy of the movie has been since, because Chris and I hadn't seen it, but everyone else has. So talk to us about... everyone else in the world has. So talk to us about sort of what happened. Tell us the story of what happens once Gremlin comes out, and if there's anything we can learn as scholars of children's horror because of that story.
Well, when it came out, it was hugely commercially successful, and I think that was mainly as a result of a very good marketing campaign which almost entirely obscured the fact that it was a horror film and instead made it look more like a sort of E.T., more wholesome film, and it really emphasized the fact that it was Spielberg who produced it. So when people saw the film, there was some controversy around the fact that they'd, taken like their 5-year-olds or whatever, expecting E.T., and then they saw Gremlins being blown up in microwaves. And as I said, that was enough, combined with Temple of Doom, to result in then a whole new film rating, which we still have today. In terms of critical reception, there was a fair bit of negative critical reception, actually. And again, I think Philippa Antunes goes over the critical reception in more detail in her book. But critics were quite taken aback by the film's quite cynical tone, and that it's and especially the way it seemed to be attacking kind of core American ideological values like little small towns and the idea of Christmas itself. But as I said, despite that, it was still very commercially successful. I think it was released in June, which is bizarre because it's a Christmas film. But I do believe that it did have a kind of re-release that Christmas. And so it was at least successful enough to warrant that. And I think, I'm not really sure much about the specifics of its life after that, but I think it would have gone on to become the kind of film that people saw, they rented on VHS and watched at sleepovers, and lots of other children's horror films like The Monster Squad have similar narratives where they reach people through those home media formats more than anything else, because you can kind of watch things without necessarily your parents knowing about it in that way. And so again, is all about the way that children's horror or horror in general is all about subversion and breaking rules and doing things you're not supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Found in the spaces sort of outside where they're supposed to be and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, okay, interesting. Is there anything else about Gremlins that we must mention before we begin to wrap up, Kat, and talk about your book more? Is there any key aspect that we must that we haven't gone over that would be worth listeners being aware of if they want to know more about this movie?
This time around, because I was watching it with the idea of animation in mind, and I was thinking especially about the sort of Looney Tunes-esque references, and Dante himself has said that it was like a Roadrunner style quality to the animation. And I just noticed that there were some Looney Tunes character toys in the department store, which kind of cemented that link, along with like Garfield and some Smurfs or something. But I also thought about Randall's inventions as maybe being a bit like Acme products from Looney Tunes, because they're all a bit rubbish. They don't work.
Yeah. They're also quite.
I wondered if was another reference.
They're also quite rubbish because they're unnecessary. Like they're solutions to things that don't need solutions for, which I think adds to that kind of stuff for stuff's sake kind of sense of the movie.
Yeah. And as well, this time I was thinking about whether, because something I talk about in the book is not in relation to Gremlins, but in relation to actually animated films, is the extent to which animation mitigates or lessens horror. And I take issue with that because I point to something like Coraline, which is stop motion animated and still terrifying, not despite, but perhaps because of the fact that it's stop motion animated. And I think actually people can just go to my blog post on the Fantasy Animation website to read my thoughts about that. But so this time I was like, well, does the fact that the Gremlins' violence is sort of cartoonish, does that make it less horrifying? And I think probably no, because it's not like a Looney Tunes in the sense that they are tangible objects. They do get torn apart, they blow up, they have blood that goes everywhere. And I guess I was interested to know what you and Chris especially thought about that aspect of the cartoonal violence.
Yeah, and I was gonna. I suppose my answer is relation to horror and comedy, actually, because I was thinking, yes, animation always sits on that knife edge between exaggeration or dilution, and as you write in the blog, nowhere is this more prevalent than in the horror genre, which does it matter that something's animated? Does that lessen the horror, or does it amplify it? In the sense, or in the case of Gremlins, is it that it still makes it horrifying, but it makes the horror funny, or does it transform in the way that I'm thinking about, I suppose, the way that genres work at the level of semantics and romantic comedy and the things that qualify the other things, black comedy, that kind of thing. And so I was wondering whether the animated horror or the children's horror or the bit that's sort of qualifying the other bit, what that does to it, how animation transforms the horror. And I wonder whether it introduces a level of comedy, because I still thought the film was horrifying, but I found the horrific moments comedic. I mean, like, there are funny bits, like when they're dressed as carol singers. That is really funny. That is because that is them trying to understand. They're learning the customs and then trying to like act them out, which I thought was really funny. And then there are some really horrific bits where one of them is using that chainsaw. But I found the horror more comedic because it was animation. It didn't lessen the horror, but it introduced an element of comedy that I don't know whether that necessarily tempered the horror, but it certainly did something. It certainly did something to it. It's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I thought the comedy element was something that was definitely worth commenting on in the film.
It's a film that speaks so much through other media examples that it's almost like it's there's a way of viewing that as like it's subverting, one more time everybody for the road, it's subverting that kind of animation physicality of that Looney Tunes. It's making that horrific because it's kind of applying it to a live action setting and it's applying it to a genre like horror, and it's revealing the grotesque within that kind of aesthetic almost. The way I read it as, there are some scenes where it's funny because they're acting like that. There are some scenes where it's horrific because they're acting like that. And Chris is quite right. There are some scenes where it's kind of both at the same time. And it's not that... I don't think it mitigates the horror. I think it adds to the tapestry of what these gremlins seem to be representing and doing and being in the space of the movie.
Actually, that's really interesting that it sort of places a Looney Tunes aesthetic within a kind of three-dimensional fictional world. What would happen if these sorts of cartoon events actually could be mapped onto a, fictionally real space?
Well, yeah.
Well, this is what happens when a gremlin picks up a chainsaw. This is how horrific and how fearful the characters are.
It's also about revealing. Talk about turning a Mogwai into a gremlin, like that metaphor we've been using. It's about revealing the violence that's inherent within the most lovely, child-friendly of entertainment forms, right? It's revealing that actually, if you sit and watch this cartoon stuff, a lot of it's very violent. And all right, you don't see blood and you don't see gore, but you see violence, you see physical pain, you see all this. Tom and Jerry is supremely violent. Roadrunner is supremely violent, but we don't think of it that way because it's coded in a quote unquote child friendly way. So I think there's an aspect to what that's doing with the kind of aesthetics of the Gremlins. The Gremlins behave like cartoon characters, but they have the capacity to actually threaten and actually scratch and actually bite and actually kill, and that makes what they're doing. I mean, there's something Nightmare on Elm Street-esque about it. That's another quite cartoony horror movie that plays with that and kind of reveals the horror within that kind of aesthetic in a nice way, but this is doing it in a different context and stuff.
And if we think about this as a Chris Columbus film, in Home Alone, there is also a lot of violence in that, but it's more cartoonal because these things happen to the wet bandits in that film that would kill a person, but they just kind of bounce back. So that one, and I think that film probably is less controversial because it doesn't have those more tangible effects like that we see in Gremlins.
Yeah, which opens a debate we have not got time to address today, but it's that classic debate with why is it that violence that doesn't have impact is considered to be better or more sanctified than violence that does. If anything, perhaps it should be the other way around. But hey, another debate, another podcast, another day. Kat, thanks so much for talking about Gremlins. Your book, Horror Films for Children, is out, available, and please do, everyone, buy their copy as soon as you can. Order it for your libraries if you're an academic. Get it on your course syllabuses, but also buy it for yourselves. It's got a wonderful cover. I see Gremlins is the front cover, so that's nice to see we're on brand. Tell us a little bit about the book more broadly, and what other case studies people can enjoy along with Gremlins if they were to purchase it.
Well, it's basically all about asking and answering the question, what happens to horror when children are the target audience? And more specifically, what happens to children in horror when children are the target audience? And my answer to that, basically, starting with Gremlins, is they get to be a lot more interesting and complicated and agentic than they generally get to be in adult horror films. And as we see in Gremlins, they also get to be really horrific. And I think that that's great, and that they should be allowed to be horrific. So, Gremlins is one of the major case studies in the book, and as you said, Gizmo's on the cover. I also talk about films like The Monster Squad, and I situate that as a post-Gremlins film, which takes advantage of the PG-13 rating. And in fact, it's very similar to Gremlins in that it's also very subversive and representing children doing all kinds of horrific things, except this time they're real physical children. I talk about animated films like Paranorman and Coraline, and I think about the aesthetics of stop motion and how that adds to or increases their horrific potential. Monster House is another animated film I talk about, but a CG animated film, and I believe I cite Chris in that chapter a bit about the virtual kind of animation, and that's in a chapter about that is also paired with The Hole, another Joe Dante film, although not an animated one, and I think about the space of the home as a source of horror. And that's sort of the very rough summary of everything that happens in the book. And hopefully what the book demonstrates is this is a category of film. It's a really interesting one. It's not impossible, although it is often hanging on an impossibility. And children's horror is great. It's like, yeah.
Agreed.
You sold us.
Yeah. And if people do want to buy it, I mean, it's wildly expensive because it's an academic book, but if people do want to buy it, there is a discount code, which I don't remember, but I'm on Twitter at Cinefeline, which is spelled C-I-N-E feline, as in the cat. And somewhere on there you'll find the discount code, which will get you about 30% off on the Bloomsbury website, which is the publisher.
Terrific. And if listeners are people access these podcasts years down the line, so if you're listening in the future, hopefully it'll be available, I'm sure, on paperback by then, and that'll make it a little bit cheaper as well if people wanted to access it. So many ways to get Kat's fab new book. I think that's been us for another week, hasn't it, Chris? We've done it. We've managed to articulate Gremlins. Kat, thank you so much for helping us through that. It looked like we sort of got it, even though we probably should have seen it about 80 times to have had any attempt to qualify to talk about this in public like everybody else, and I'm sure people will be watching it over the Christmas period, so I hope this has wet your whistle to kind of get back in and give it one more rewatch. So I think all that's left to do is to say thanks so much for coming on the show, Kat. It's been a real pleasure to chat to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are Fantasy Animation. You can find us at fantasy-animation.org, as well as on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Fananim Research, Fananim Research. You can access Kat's blog post that we've referenced on this episode in that. And do we have any more children's horror in the podcast archive, Chris? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If we haven't, we should, and we should do some more.
Why would you ask me this for the first time?
Why would I ask you?
Corpse Bride.
We've talked about Corpse Bride.
Corpse.
Well done, thank you, Kat. Thank you. Yes, with Emily Mantel from the film. Chris and I don't remember a single thing we do after we press gut finish on this. Thank you.
If you'd have done loads of children's horror already, and this was the first time you'd invited me on, I'd been really offended.
This is it. You see, we've been saving it for when the book came out, so that's the excuse.
Yeah.
So you can access other examples in the past from things we can't even remember saying. But that's been us for another episode, and we will see you next time.
Bye.